first meeting of the class, I made a point to stress that this is about the history of the growth of a world faith community designated on the term Islam, as opposed to being a course in culture or art or religion or civilization. This is a course basically in social history. So when you take this as your starting point, the question of who the Muslims are is problematic, because at every period in history it's a different group, not only as generations pass, but as new territories, new ethnic groups, new language groups become incorporated into the Muslim fold. The religion changes, the culture changes, everything changes, because we do not have a single fixed concept of what Islam is. This does not mean that there are not today, and that there have not been at many points in the past, groups of Muslims who have a very strong conviction that they know exactly what Islam is, how it should be practiced, how it has always been, and they see it as immutable. But there have always been other Muslims who don't see it that way. So the tendency that needs to be resisted, and which has not been very well represented in the area of Islamic studies, is the idea that you study Islam for a certain period in a certain area, and then you know what it is, and then you can simply read it forward down to today. Because like every faith community, it's always changing to some degree. And you cannot go on the basis that you can know exactly what it is at any given point. So when we start out with the death of the Prophet on June 8th, 632, in the city of Medina in Western Arabia, almost all of the people who followed him, people who come to be called Muslims, although it's not clear that the word was yet used at that time. Fred Donner, whose book I've asked you to read, believes that the first word for a believer was a mu'min, a person who has faith, and that Muslim, meaning a person who makes submission to the will of God, is a slightly later term. So that the title I talked about for the first political office, and in a way the key political office in Islamic thinking, that of the Caliph, was initially the Amir al-Mu'mineen, the commander of the faithful. This does not mean that the term Amir al-Muslimin has never been used. And indeed, in Morocco, this was a royal title at one time. But the earliest evidence indicates that the commander of the faithful was the first title used. So the people who were the mu'mineen, the believers at the time of the Prophet's death, were almost entirely Arab. There were a few who were not, some of them very close to the Prophet. But by and large, almost everyone was an Arab. I started talking last time about what that means. And the first thought that comes to most people's mind is based upon 19th century notions of national identity being key to ethno-linguistic qualifications. That is to say, people who speak a language as a mother tongue are therefore part of that community. But historically speaking, most of the people who today identify themselves as Arab at the time of the lifetime of the Prophet came from ancestors who did not speak Arabic, because Arabic was spoken in a fairly limited area. Arabic is a Semitic language. It belongs to the western branch of the Semitic languages. The eastern branch being represented by what was spoken in the Assyrian Empire, in Babylonia, that is to say in Iraq. That would be Eastern Semitic. Western Semitic would include Northwest Semitic with Hebrew, Aramaic, and Arabic, and then there's a Southwest Semitic that goes into the languages of Yemen, which were different from Arabic. I won't go into details except to note that those of you who have taken Arabic or considering taking Arabic should know that the way in which the language operates is dramatically different from the way any Indo-European language operates. If you have gone to Hebrew school, you have sort of a leg up on this sort of thing, but basically it is a difficult language to learn. Particularly Arabic as compared to the other Semitic languages that survive because it has a more extensive and complete set of grammatical or morphological formulations than the other languages do. The language was not a unified language at the time of the Prophet. We know that in the Arabian Peninsula and in the what we now think of the Iraqi, Syrian, Jordanian desert, or also known as ISIS land, we know that there were different dialects that were spoken. Even fairly close to Mecca, there were different dialects. There was not a perfectly agreed upon and consistent writing system. If you go back to a century or two before the time of the Prophet, you find different variants in the characters used to write Arabic. And Arabic was not a written language in the sense of the word that we think of a written language having a library of writings that can be consulted. There was a library of composition that Arabs were very proud of and that they tended to memorize, and this consisted of poetry. So that the poetry of the Arabs was considered their greatest art and cultural expression. In the eyes of some people, this makes it the most important art of Islam. This is something that Edward Said wrote in his book covering Islam. He said the only art of the Muslims is poetry. I recall mentioning to him that he was leaving out Ottoman architecture, Persian miniatures, Mughal miniatures in India, and he was leaving out a huge array of art, and that's when he said Muslim, he actually meant Arab, but he said that the book was too far gone, couldn't change it. But it's not uncommon for people who have an Arab background to tend to think of Islam and Arab as being synonymous in some fashion. But going back to the period of the Prophet, Arab was a much more limited concept. The dialects that were spoken were not completely understandable from one part of the peninsula to another, just as colloquial Arabic today is not entirely understandable from Morocco across to Iraq. Because of this variation, the Quran, the collection of the revelations that was put together after the death of the Prophet, becomes the standardizing influence in the Arabic language. So the classical Arabic, what we now call classical Arabic, is the Arabic of the Quran more than anything else. There are certainly variants of the Quran that are not standard, but today when we think of classical Arabic, or the Arabic that most people learn when they start out, it is a language that became codified, so to speak, with the Quran, in the same way that Dante's Divine Comedy becomes the language that codifies Italian, despite the fact you have many different dialects spoken in various parts of Italy. The Arabian Peninsula and the northward extension of the desert into Jordan, Iraq, and Syria was a barren land. The most heavily populated part of the Arabian Peninsula was Yemen, because Yemen, down in the southwest corner of the peninsula, receives monsoon rains in the spring. It's a mountainous area, and the highland areas of Yemen were very fertile. You could grow wheat, you could grow cotton, and then at a later point, sometime around the 14th century, people started to grow coffee, and they started to grow khat. Khat being the classic narcotic of the Arabian Peninsula, which can be found in certain Yemeni communities in New York, even though it's a restricted commodity. Chewing khat all afternoon long is still a favored Yemeni thing to do, but the leaves have to be fresh. These are leaves of the tree. But coffee and khat grow up at about the same time. One becomes a worldwide colonial addiction, and the other becomes a much more localized addiction. The Arabs who lived outside of Yemen, who lived in the desert, or in more or less barren parts of the peninsula, tended to be nomadic. Their nomadism was mapped mentally in the form of genealogies, so that everyone knew what the genealogy was of their particular lineage, of their particular subgroup, of their particular larger tribal group, and so forth and so on. The same thing would apply to villagers in Yemen, or even today we can find certain tribal names that existed back in the 7th century. But the tribal organization of the desert Arabs probably had somewhat of a greater influence. In any case, in the city of Mecca, there was a tribe named Quraysh, and this was the tribe to which the Prophet Muhammad belonged, and he belonged to a lineage within the tribe of Quraysh known as the Hashim. So today, for example, when we see something like the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan, it's called the Hashemite kingdom because the rulers of Jordan since World War I have been direct lineal descendants of the Prophet Muhammad by way of his grandson Al-Hussein. So these terms do not lose their potency, their importance with time. Abu Bakr Baghdadi, who claims to be the caliph of the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq, one of the names that he uses is Al-Qurashi, meaning a member of the tribe of Quraysh, because in tradition, anyone who claims to be the caliph should be a member of the tribe of Quraysh, if not indeed a member of the clan of Hashim. An awful lot can be said about the Arabs of the desert. I'm not going to go into it in any detail. One point, however, is that when all of the members of a community belong to a particular socio-economic, ethnic, anthropological formation, what do you want to call it? They all share, to a substantial degree, a set of customs. And one of the things that we will find evolving in the society of Islam as it grows is a question of whether the rules that people come to think apply to all Muslims rules that gradually gain the force of law and become part of Islamic law. The question of whether these rules are, whether they supersede the customs of the tribes of Arabia, or whether they are complementary to those customs. In other words, do we take for granted that all Muslims have a certain Arab tribal background in terms of the customary ways of behaving? Or do we think of things as starting over with Islam? Some schools of thought will see them as complementary, others will see things as new, and which group you belong to says something about the way in which you visualize being Arab as being part of the faith community of Islam. Back in 1967, it was in the summer. I was back home in Rockford, Illinois, and for some reason I don't really recall, I tried to bring to mind what the Arabic word was for wheel, and I found that I couldn't remember it. So I thought, well, maybe my 7 years of Arabic was wasted if I don't know such a commonplace word. I shall know that way. Or it may be that I've just never encountered the word. And not wanting to give up on my learning of Arabic, I decided I hadn't encountered the word in classical Arabic. So I thought, if all the stuff I've read, I've never run into a wheel or a wheeled vehicle, maybe there weren't any wheeled vehicles. And I thought about that for a while, and I thought, well, if you read the Bible, there are chariots. And if you look at ancient art in the Middle East, there are ox carts. What happened to them? Did the wheels disappear? I mentioned this to a senior colleague, and I thought I would work on the hypothesis that all the wheels in the Middle East disappeared. He said, that's such a good idea. If I weren't a good friend, I would steal it, because we are, after all, professors. And then I mentioned it to various people that I was going to work on this. And eventually I was summoned to the office of the Associate Director of Harvard's Middle East Center. And he said, I hear you're planning to write a book on camels. And I said, yes. He said, do not do that, because it will ruin your career, because this is the stereotype of the Arab, and no Western scholar should be identified with fleshing out a stereotype, needless to say, thought of as a negative stereotype, camel jockeys and the like. And I left his office thinking, it must be a really good idea, because disagreeing with my professors was a hallmark of my entire career. As I pursued research, I concluded that at a certain point, between roughly 300 BC and 300 AD, over that period of time, all of the wheeled vehicles in the Middle East disappeared. And this raised the question of why would a tool as useful as a wheel be abandoned in a historical, social, economic situation in which there was no general decay of culture, there was no backsliding in technology, the region remained prosperous? It simply changed its transportation economy. Pursuing that, I wrote a book called The Camel and the Wheel, which is available online if anyone wants to read it. It's a good book, a lot of fun, lots of pictures. The upshot of the book, from the point of view of a course like this, is that the status of the Arabs as a part of the population mix in the Middle East changed with the disappearance of the wheel. Because as the wheels disappeared, the heavier transport shifted to pack camels, and the camels were bred by Arabs. And Arabs who had previously been regarded by the farming communities on the fringes of the Arabian Peninsula as desert barbarians moved from being on the margin of the economy to being absolutely central to the economy, because they now controlled the transportation system. So I want to briefly discuss how this occurred, because it's a story I like to tell. There has been a certain amount written on when the camel became domestic and where. I have pretty firm opinions on that matter that by and large have been adopted by other people, which is that sometime around 3000 BC, camels first became useful for humans in southern Arabia, the area of Yemen and Oman. Now I say became useful because there's a question of did they become domestic? This is a tricky question because so many people believe that domestication is a process that is imposed by humans upon certain species of animals, that humans domesticate animals in an active sense. There is further the idea that very few animals are capable of being domesticated. This is all pretty much the Jared Diamond view of things, which in this and in many other particulars has been wrong. But the fact of the matter is, to become domestic, some breeding population of animals must go through changes that lead to tameness becoming a hereditary characteristic. There have been two experiments in the 20th century, one with foxes and one with rats, where animals were taken essentially from the wild, put in a laboratory, and live there as a captive community for a period of generations to see what would happen. In both cases, about 80% of the captive animals did not reproduce in the first generation. The reason was that the environment they were in, being captive in a laboratory, fed by human attendants and so forth, was so agitating. It created such very intense fight or flight reactions, so much adrenaline output, that they were unable to carry out sexual activities. Of those rats or foxes that did reproduce in the first generation, 20%, most of them did not mother the young. They had to be fostered onto lab rats in order to survive. But it means that in the second generation, all of the animals were the descendants, the offspring, of that 20% that was able to reproduce. Now, what distinguished the reproducing from the non-reproducing animals? The non-reproducing animals were excitable and feisty. The reproducing animals were laid back. And they thought, well, I'm sexually inclined. If you want to watch, I don't care. And they had very low, or comparatively low, adrenaline output and fight or flight reaction. In the wild, those animals in any wild population that have very low adrenaline output do not survive to reproduce. Because they think, oh, here's a carrot, and I think that's the shadow of a hawk. Carrot, hawk. You know, that carrot is damn good. So they eat the carrot, and the hawk eats them. So they don't reproduce. So that for species that are subject to a predator environment, the tendency in the wild is for the high adrenaline animals to reproduce more effectively than the low adrenaline animals. In captive situations, the low adrenaline animals are the ones that reproduce differentially more, both because of the conditions of captivity and because the high adrenaline animals are nasty. So that, let's say, with cats, we believe that the parent stock of a house cat was a wild cat of about that size, probably in Egypt, about the size of a house cat, and that they came to hang out around human communities at the same time that human communities started to store grain and other things that attracted rodents. So the cats came to live among the humans because they ate the rodents. So the humans were happy to have the rodent-eating cats around, but if the cat scratched the baby or bit, you killed the cat. So the cats that survived were differentially the more passive cats. And over a period of generations, the passive bred the passive bred the passive. And you started to have an increasingly clear differentiation between the tame cats that were hereditary, that were tamed by heredity, and the cats that were still wild, which you then killed. And this is where the domestic cat comes from. Now, there are some animals that do not have predators in the wild. Elephants, for example. There are no domestic elephants in the sense of elephants that are born being hereditarily tame. The domestic elephants of India and Southeast Asia are all born in the wild, and they are captured when they're maybe 10 years old or so, and then they're trained, because in the absence of predators, they do not have high adrenaline output. By the way, for the rats and the foxes, by the 30th generation, the weight of the adult adrenal glands of the surviving animals was about a quarter of the weight of the wild stock. So you have animals that are at the top of the food chain are not tamed by heredity. They are tamed by disposition. So that, for example, you can train a lion or a tiger. They're at the top of the food chain. Nothing eats them. They can lie around in the sun all day long and sleep without worrying that some little gang of hyenas is going to sneak up on them. And this makes them what I call tame in the wild, and they can be trained. Whereas you can never have a trained gazelle act. Gazelles will leap about and run at the slightest provocation. So the question with camels is, were camels tame in the wild? They live in the desert, and one-hump camels native to the Arabian desert, apparently. Did anything happen to make camels domestic? Or was it simply a matter of going out and putting a rope around the neck of a camel and leading him home? Did the camel really care where he went? It is an interesting question because we have no historical record of there ever being wild one-hump camels. Now we know there were, that is to say archaeologically, we can find bits of evidence, images of camels and surely go back to before the time that they were domestic. But we don't have any history of people out hunting wild camels. The camels in Arabia were always owned. Now, there was a notion that some of them were owned by spirit beings, as say the camels of the jinn. But by and large, there were no wild camels, even at the time of the Prophet. They were all thought of as beings belonging to one tribe or another. So when camels first become used, they may not have been domestic, but they were used. And they were used because they were extremely strong animals, the strongest, other than the elephant, of any of the domestic animals, at least of that era. And they seem to have been used to carry incense from the mountains of southern Arabia down to the seaports, where it would be loaded onto boats that would go up the Red Sea to Egypt, because Egypt had a prodigious appetite for frankincense and myrrh. Frankincense and myrrh are aromatic resins that grow, the trees grow in southern Arabia and in Somalia. You can go down to a city like Mecca in southern Yemen now and go into the market and you'll just see baskets full of frankincense for sale, very, very cheap if you want to buy frankincense. And you just go up to the tree and take a hatchet and scar the tree with a chop, and then the resin seeps out, and then when it dries, you break it off and you get these globs of yellow resin. So that throughout Arabia down to the present day, aromatics, incense, is very common. You go to an audience with a prince or somebody with a lot of money, and one of the early things that will happen in the course of your visit is that someone will come by with an incense burner with some frankincense burning in it. And just for your information, what you do is you waft it. You sense yourself with this lovely aroma. So incense was a very important product. In Egypt, when you embalmed Uncle Charlie, you filled him with, a cubic foot of frankincense and myrrh to keep them from smelling so bad. But the question of getting this incense from Southern Arabia to Egypt, because there was none of it grew in Egypt, was a question of carrying it from the highlands where it grows down to the seaport. And I think that's where camels first came into use. And I think that because the first place that camels were used outside of Arabia was in Somalia. And the Somali camel culture, which is dramatically different from the camel culture of Sudan or the Sahara Desert. Somali camel culture appears to be extremely old. The hallmark of this is that Somalis do not ride camels. They use them only for carrying burdens. When the British ruled Somalia, they set up a camel corps, bringing in camels and camel saddles from India, and the Somalis were in camel corps. In order to get the salary, they would ride the camels. But as soon as the British left, they quit riding the camels. The camel corps disappeared because, according to my informant, any level-headed Somali said, "Why would I get on top of a camel? I'm making a target. That's, I'm so visible. It's better to walk on the ground and, walk alongside the camel." But this, is part of a model I worked on, suggesting that camels were used for carrying loads, not for riding, in their first uses. Now this well, this might seem to be very arcane. Well, it is very arcane, but it has consequences. Well, let's take your paradigmatic camel. Now you want this very strong animal, but the spinal process is sort of arc like this. So, structurally, it can carry a very, very heavy weight. 500 to 1,000 pounds is not unusual. But the question is, what do you do about this? The hump is a big lump of fat. The reason the camel has a hump is because it lives in an environment in which for many months of the year there is virtually no food. And the animal draws on the fat in the hump as a food reserve. Originally, the earliest camels may have had maybe the ones with two humps. But in Arabia, the one hump seems to have become standard, probably because the amount of fat you can store in, let's say, 2 cones full of fat versus 1 large cone. The ratio of volume to surface area is such that you have less surface area if you have 1 large hump. And that means that you have less skin that's exposed to the sun. So the single hump is an adaptation for living in a torrid environment. And the 2-hump camels are from Central Asia, where it's extremely cold in the winter. So the 1-hump camel appears to be an evolutionary adaptation for the torrid temperatures of the Arabian Peninsula. Now, with a 2-hump camel, if you want to put a saddle on it or carry something, well, that's what that little hole, that dip is between the humps. But if you have a 1-hump camel, there's a question of what do you do about hump? There are 3 possible solutions to this problem. Let's say A, B, and C. The earliest form of a saddle seems to have been to take a bunch of reed sheets, sort of like thin mattresses, and put them on the camel. I will pick up the chunk eventually, so you totally cover the hump. And then you tie this on with a 1/4 of a mile of rope, almost exactly in that pattern. And then you could tie things to the rope, but you covered up the hump entirely. In Somalia, they devised something where they have 2 long sticks on each side, and those sticks would be what you would tie the load to. But you can't ride this very well. So, for riding, position C is where you sit if you are riding bareback, which is not a smart thing to do with a camel. The reason you sit in position C is because if you sit in A, the way the camel stands up, going like that, you pitch over and you're thrown off. The reason you don't sit on B is because it's a big ball of fat, and it's unstable. But with C, you can hang on to the long hair growing on the hump. So So when it gets up, you can stay on. So that means that you can put a pad back here, and you can tie the pad on and anchor it with some wooden arches up front. And then you kneel like this, and you ride from behind. This appears to be the type of saddle that was devised in Southern Arabia. Consequently, I labeled it the South Arabian saddle. No one has ever disagreed with me on that because nobody cares. So the South Arabian saddle is still used as a baggage saddle in many, many countries. And in Southern and Eastern Arabia, it is used as the standard riding saddle. When you see pictures of the camel races in Qatar or Dubai, the rider is sitting behind the hump. It used to be they would kidnap little Pakistani boys and tie them on to be the riders. Now they use robot camel riders. And that works. So you sat behind the hump. Now, how did you control the animal? If you were riding it and you were kneeling on a pad behind the hump. We want the pad, by the way, because camels have very bony and weak hindquarters. Their strength is in their shoulders, the forequarters. So you don't want to sit on the bony rump of the camel for very long. It's just dreadfully uncomfortable. So what you did was that you knelt behind the hump, but now you're like 4 feet away from the management end of the animal. So you have a rein, which is a rope. The rope is tied either to a ring in the septum of the camel's nose or around the lower jaw. Somehow it's tied to its face. And this is basically your brake. No, I want you to stop, camel, so I will dislocate your jaw or rip your septum out if you don't stop. Now, camel's not stupid, it stops. But the question is, how do you get it to go from right to left? So then you have something called a camel stick, which is about this long and has like a back scratcher. It usually has a little fork-like thing on the end. And you tap the camel on the side of the neck. The camel doesn't like being irritated, so it turns the other direction. Then you tap on this side of the neck, now it doesn't want to go that way, so it goes the other way. So now you're riding behind, in this rear position, and you're directing the camel with the camel stick in one hand. You have a rein in the other hand. Now, this works, and this is an efficient way of riding camels. And up until around 300 BC, it appears to have been the normal way of riding camels. Everywhere where one-hump camels came to be used. But the problem is, supposing you're in a battle, what do you do if you're riding a camel? The weapon of ancient Arabia, before the rise of Islam, was the bow and arrow. So here I have a camel stick and a rein and a bow and arrows back here. And how in the world can I fight on a camel? Of course, you have to get off. But the result was that the people who bred the camels and sold them for caravan work, because gradually, instead of using ships from Southern Arabia, people started to have caravans that would go north and south in the Arabian Peninsula to Syria or up to Iraq. Eventually, those people who were servicing this caravan trade came to be very resentful of the merchants who were collecting all the profits. And so they took steps to take control of the trade. The grand analogy to this is the 1973 oil price rises of OPEC, where up to that point, the Western companies and the Western governments were reaping all of the profits virtually of the Middle Eastern oil industry. And then the OPEC countries said, let's jack up the prices. And the West had to pay because they didn't have a solution to that. They didn't have a way to stop OPEC from raising the prices. So what was important for these camel breeders was to find a way in which they could exert military power. And they could prevent the merchants from the settled lands in Yemen or the settled lands in Syria and Iraq, could prevent them from taking all the profits. So they invented a new type of camel saddle. They took the two arches that they had used to anchor the pad in the back, put one here, connected them with cross pieces, then tied this all on with straps, with a pad here, and they sat on top of the hump. And this is what I have called the North Arabian saddle. There is what we should add. The North Arabian saddle had a very high pommel, a very high cantle, the front and the back. So you could loop the rein around the pommel. You could hook your knee around it so you wouldn't fall off easily. And you could use a lance or a sword. And because you were riding 2 to 3 feet higher than any horseman, because of the height of the camel and the fact that horses were not very big in those days, you could strike down against any soldier that was accompanying the caravan. And the first descriptions we have of Arabs being militarily effective, are described. They struck down with their spears and their swords. The earliest depictions we have of Arabs in battle using the old saddles showed 2 people riding on each camel, one to control the camel stick, to hold the camel stick in the rein, and the other sitting behind him to use the bow and arrow. This was not effective, but we do have a number of pictures from the Assyrian Empire of camels being used in battle this way. But by 300 or so BC, somewhere in northern Libya, this new saddle was invented and gradually caught on. We see it showing up in Roman coins from southern Jordan by about 100 BC. And one of the consequences of this is that the profits from the caravan trade started to move into the desert instead of into the coffers of the merchants in the settled lands. So that you started to have caravan cities that were populated by Arabs out in the middle of the desert. In Jordan, around 300 BC, you have the city of Petra. In Syria, you have the city of Camel. And these were extremely luxurious commercial centers. The caravan trade did not originate with them, but rather it shifted from the coastal communities, the agricultural communities, into the desert to become the financial mainstay of kingdoms based on Petra and Palmyra. Now, by the 3rd century AD, the Romans had pretty much taken over both Petra and Palmyra because they were very close to Roman territory. So, somewhere around 500 AD, a new caravan city, or caravan center, it may not have been a little city, came into being in Western Arabia, and that was Mecca. Mecca was too far away from Syria to be readily conquered by the Romans, too far away from Yemen, set to its south, to be readily conquered by whoever was ruling Yemen, sometimes Persian, sometimes Ethiopian, sometimes native dynasties. And too far away from Iraq to be readily conquered by the Persian rulers in Iraq. So Mecca was ideally placed to remain independent as a caravan city, whereas the earlier caravan cities had all been subdued by greater imperial military force. Now, around 300 AD, a Roman emperor named Diocletian promulgated an edict on prices for the entire Roman Empire. And in that edict, he specified the prices to be charged for all sorts of things, including for the transport of goods. And it turns out that if you were transporting goods in the Roman Empire in 300 AD, the cost of transporting goods by camelback was some 20 to 25% cheaper than to move them in an ox cart. And we have a separate document from Palmyra showing a similar differential, that it was simply not economical to use an ox cart. So what happened is that as the Arabs gained economic and military strength, they started to assert themselves in the general transport economy by using the animals that were inherently efficient. Now you might say, well, why don't I have a camel cart instead of an ox cart? Well, that's because you're not an Arab. I mean, if you were an Arab in the desert, why have a cart at all? You don't have any wood to speak of. So it really is, there was one area where you did have camel carts, and that was in Tunisia. But by and large, you simply use pack camels. And the Arabs gradually took over pretty much the entire hauling economy of the Middle East, and the wheeled vehicles disappeared. Now what that meant is that it was well underway by 300 AD, and Muhammad is born around 570. It means that by the time of the lifetime of the Prophet, the Arabs who had been marginal desert dwellers for hundreds and hundreds of years had become a vital part of the macro economy of the region. Let's say if you were a farmer at harvest time, instead of loading your harvest into a cart and having oxen pull it to a market, the Arabs would come by with a group of camels, and they would carry it to the market. You didn't have to own your transport vehicles. Arabs seem to have become important participants in trade who look far outside of the Arabian Peninsula, far outside of the area where they were surrounded by people who shared the same language. So that we have images of one-hump camels as far east as Samarkand in Central Asia, before the rise of Islam. Now those animals had to come from Arabia. The native camels of Iran and of Central Asia were two-hump camels. So we know that the Arabs reached into Iran and were part of the transport regime. On the other hand, Turkey, what we now call Turkey, Anatolia, did not use camels. They had ox carts. The reason for this is because as you went into Turkey, you had much colder winters. And the camels of the desert were very sensitive to temperature. So the Arabs became involved in the transportation system, going eastward and going westward out of Arabia, and not in particular going northward. And this then becomes the pattern of the Arab conquest. You probably would be ridiculed for making an argument saying that the Arab conquest followed the path of the camel caravans, but you wouldn't be far wrong in empirical terms. So there has been an evolution of the status of the Arabs in the area in the centuries just preceding the appearance of Muhammad. And though that's rarely talked about and people write about early Islamic history, it relates to the status of the community of Mecca in which Muhammad was born. Some people have argued, in a hyperbolic fashion, that Mecca was a banking center, that it was a great caravan center that had annual caravans to Syria and Yemen and had vast quantities of money. This is a vast exaggeration. Other people have argued that Mecca was a collection of huts. It had no permanent buildings, that it was scarcely even a settled area in the time of the Prophet, and it had no significant trade of any kind, and that everything written in Arabic sources about the trade of Mecca is a later falsification. That's wrong. You can read this debate in a book by Patricia Crona called Mecca and the
Meccan Trade and the Rise of Islam.
Meccan Trade and the Rise of Islam. You're free to read this book. I disagree with it profoundly, but you'll find all of Patricia Crona's works are extremely assertive and on occasion are very useful. This doesn't have to be one of those occasions. But it led to this question of, did Islam come into being in an environment that was commercial, as opposed to being either nomadic tribes, as you would have had in the deserts around Mecca, or being agricultural villages, as you would have had in Yemen. And if it was a commercial community, in what way does that affect the later history of Islam? There was a vogue among scholars for a long time to think about monotheism as being the most important aspect of the appearance of the Islamic religion. A prophet preaching that he is the messenger of God, that it is the one God, the creator God, who will judge at the last judgment the fate of all humans. There are no other gods. Allah, there is no God but Allah. And so people will say, well, is there some sort of natural history of religion so that you go from many gods, to 2 or 3 gods, to one God and Jesus? In other words, a lot of these scholars were people who were from a Christian background, who saw a culmination in Christianity of a natural history of religions. Needless to say, scholars who came from India or a Hindu background didn't really see it that way. They said, one God? Why don't I have a God for this, a God for that, a God for the other thing? What's the point of having one God? It's just kind of poverty-stricken. So I don't think we get very far by trying to debate why you had one God. Nor do I think that it, as one visualizes the prophet coming to the marketplace with the revelation, and saying, there's one God. And people say, oh, one, darn. I thought it was two, but one. Now I'm totally transformed. Monotheism is a very interesting philosophical and religious concept, and a very important one for Islam. But it isn't particularly a generative one when you're talking about how this faith community came into being. More important, probably, is the location of Mecca being too far away from Yemen and Syria to be influenced by the Christian ecclesiastical authorities in those places. Too far away from Iraq. In other words, it was a caravan city that was difficult to bring under military and economic control from some other powerful area, and it was very difficult to bring under ecclesiastical control when you had a religion being preached that recognized Judaism and Christianity as being predecessor religions, but did not recognize the ecclesiastical authorities of Judaism or Christianity as having any role to play in Western Arabia. In other words, if you think of this caravan city as protecting its autonomy economically, you could look at the preaching of Islam as protecting its autonomy ideologically. This is a hypothesis. I can't prove anything along these lines, but it helps me in trying to understand this, and also in trying to understand what happened after the Prophet's death. Because, of course, one of the things that could have happened was that the people of Mecca who had followed Muhammad might have lost their political integrity and come under the influence of some ruler from some other land. It's not as though nobody ever tried to conquer Mecca. There is a story in the Quran of a military expedition from Yemen, supposedly with an elephant as part of it, that had an expedition against Mecca and was stopped by birds dropping pebbles that caused sores to break out. So a little bit on the mythological side, but it, Mecca was a desirable place from a commercial point of view. So the people around Muhammad were Arabs, but as Arabs, they divided into three political categories. First, there were the Arabs who had migrated in the year 622 from Mecca to Medina. This migration in 622 is called the Hijra, and the people who made the migration are called the Muhajirun. So the Muhajirun were Muhammad's followers from Mecca. By going to Medina, they had severed their personal ties with the clans that they were related to, or the lineages they related to back in Mecca. So these were the people who had committed themselves in a very profound way to the leadership of Muhammad. Then you had two groups in Medina, the Aus and the Khazraj, two different Arab tribes. There were also several smaller Jewish tribes that were in various alliances with either the Aus or the Khazraj. And the Aus and the Khazraj had been feuding for some period of time. if the general story of Muhammad's life that we have from the Arabic sources can be relied upon, the way in which he came to go to Medina goes back to the year 619, which is the year his wife died. As long as his wife Khadijah was alive, it was the only wife he had. Subsequently, he had a number of wives, but Khadijah was the only one up until her death in 619. In that year also, we are told that he made a trip to a nearby oasis town, the town of Ta'if, and tried to get the people of Ta'if to accept him and his message. And the people of Ta'if threw stones and drove him away. So he was not finding a good reception for his preaching there. And then there was a fair, an annual fair connected with the pilgrimage in Mecca, in which he met people from the Aus and the Khazraj. And over the next couple of years, an agreement was made, a formal agreement, that he would come with his followers to Medina, and that in Medina he would be the arbiter who would solve, or would be the source of peace between the Aus and the Khazraj. Together, the Aus and Khazraj became known as the Ansar, meaning the helpers. The business of Muhammad coming to Medina seems to revolve around his being an arbiter. And in the culture of that era, in the Arabian Peninsula, the notion of having an arbitrator when you had long-term feuds was well accepted. But it was also accepted that the arbitration would relate to the ability of the arbitrator to ground his judgment in the unseen world, so that people who were in the category of a kahin, a seer or a soothsayer, whatever you want to call it. This is cognate with Hebrew kohen for a priest. A kahin was judged to be someone who had contact with the spirit world. And this contact with the spirit world was signified by his pronouncing sort of ambiguous or suggestive phrases in rhyming prose. Rhyming prose in Arabic is in the center. That little superscript C is the consonant I, which is pronounced yeah. So the rhyming prose was characteristic of the kahins. And kahins were often people who were not rooted in a single tribe, and they were often called upon to be arbitrators. So it wasn't necessarily that you brought in an arbitrator to apply a set of laws, because there were no laws. You just had tribal custom. Nor was it necessarily someone who would be called upon to apply common sense, but rather someone who was called upon to represent the will of the unseen world. So the likelihood is that Muhammad, as I've said, was seen by everyone to be someone who was in touch with the unseen world. And this made him very suitable for being an arbitrator. Whether you agreed with him that he was the messenger of the one true God, or whether you considered him simply a kahan, someone who was in touch with the unseen world in a less exclusive fashion. So Muhammad came to Medina, and you had provisions made for integrating the Muhajirun with the Ansar. But by and large, the Muhajirun play the dominant role, both during the lifetime of the Prophet and in the political circumstances that followed his death. It's a fairly small circle of people in Mecca who shaped the community after the death of the Prophet in 622. The third category of Arabs would consist of those people who lived elsewhere in the peninsula, who were neither from Mecca nor Medina. And toward the end of Muhammad's life, delegations from tribes elsewhere in the peninsula are said to have come to Medina to reach an agreement with the Prophet to accept his religious views in return for paying a tax and engaging in certain ritual demands. There's no indication that these delegations that came to Medina knew much of anything about the Quran, because the Quran wasn't a collected document at this point. The representatives that Muhammad sent to different parts of the Arabian Peninsula would have known something. Whether they all do the same thing, or whether they all approach their embassy to other tribes in the same way, it's very hard to know. Those Arabs end up on the margins of the early Islamic community, but eventually they play very important roles, particularly when you have conquests that are beginning, because the manpower required for the conquest comes from all over the Arab tribal world. It's not specifically from either Mecca or Medina, though many of the commanders are Meccans or Medinas. So, this gets me to the point of talking about conquest. How do you go from having a grief-stricken community that has lost its connection with the divine, never to recover it, on a sad day in June? How do you go from there to the creation of an empire? This is an act of conquest, but there are many interpretations, many theories about how it occurred and what its consequences were. And I'll start talking about that next Tuesday.